They say a person doesn't just vanish, that even in chaos, there are signs, crumbs of truth left behind. But on February 17th, 2023, Antonio Ellis didn't leave crumbs. He left confusion, worry, silence. That evening, he was supposed to pick up dinner from his favorite Thai spot off Crenshaw. Rachel, his wife of 17 years, had asked him to be home by 7. The Lakers were playing. Antonio never missed a Lakers game, not even on his worst days. But by 8:14 p.m., the food was cold on the kitchen counter. By 9:26, Rachel's calls were going to voicemail. And by 10:47, she was standing in front of a silver Toyota Camry, its driver's door slightly ajar, key still in the ignition. There was no blood, no struggle, just that eerie stillness of something gone very, very wrong. Inside the glove compartment was a folded note, cheap paper, rushed handwriting, black ink, 7 words. That was all. We have Antonio Ellis. Bring $150,000 or he dies. No name, no deadline, no instructions. Just a threat, simple, raw, and terrifying. Rachel said she read it twice before her knees buckled. The kind of note you only see in movies. The kind you pray is a mistake. But this was real. By midnight, the LAPD Robbery Homicide Division had cordoned off the alley. Officers whispered over radios. Rachel answered the same questions, over and over again, each time with a voice that cracked just a little more. He never goes anywhere without telling me. He doesn't have enemies. He's just an accountant. But the facts were facts. Antonio was gone, and someone wanted money. The strange part? Antonio wasn't rich. He didn't work in finance for some hedge fund or laundering operation. He managed books for a mid-tier furniture company in Inglewood. A clean man. No debts. No gambling. No affairs. At least, none that anyone could prove. So why $150,000? Why him? And why that note, left so carelessly, like they want to be found? Was it a message? A warning? Or a game? What began as a missing persons report was now a ticking clock. And as the hours passed, one thing became brutally clear. If someone didn't step up with that money, Antonio Ellis might never be seen again. And the city, it was just waking up to the fact that one of their own had vanished. And the first clue was already whispering secrets no one wanted to hear. You're watching Vic's Crime Cases Exposed, where we bring you real cases, strange twists, and the chilling truths that hide in plain sight. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories reach. By the 3rd day, detectives began pulling the threads of Antonio's life, and what they found wasn't chaos. It was control slowly slipping through fingers that had once gripped tightly. On paper, he was an accountant. Quiet, disciplined, measured. But paper never shows the weight someone carries. What started to emerge was a man teetering on the edge of a life carefully constructed and quietly crumbling. Antonio had been working long hours, longer than anyone at the firm could recall. Not for ambition, not for passion, but out of necessity. Colleagues remembered the shift. At first, it was small. He stopped taking lunches. He'd mutter excuses about deadlines no one else was aware of. Then came the calls, personal, midday interruptions from numbers he'd always send straight to voicemail. One assistant remembered catching a glimpse of a name on his phone screen. Federal Inquiry. He didn't answer. He never did, but his face drained when it lit up. Credit reports later confirmed what he had kept buried. For credit cards, all maxed out, 2 overdue personal loans, and a recent audit notice from the IRS dated just 5 weeks before his disappearance. Antonio Ellis wasn't just stressed. He was cornered, quietly, invisibly, and for longer than anyone realized. The people around him started noticing changes. He had always been reserved, but this was different. One co-worker described it best. He stopped laughing. He'd used to tell dry little jokes when the office got tense. Lately, he'd just sit through meetings, arms folded, eyes unfocused. When approached, he snapped, not violently, but with a sharpness that lingered in the air long after he walked away. At least 3 employees mentioned that Antonio had become a stranger in his own cubicle. There was something in his silence that made others uncomfortable. Then came the footage. Security cameras from a parking garage 3 blocks away showed Antonio walking to his car that Friday evening. He wasn't followed. No one waited for him. There was no altercation, no rush, no panic. Just a man opening his car door, pausing for a moment as if considering something and stepping inside. Detectives noted the detail immediately. His posture, the way he glanced at his rearview mirror before shutting the door. It wasn't the walk of someone afraid. It was the walk of someone ready. Forensics turned up even more questions. The ransom note? Folded neatly, placed inside the glove box, almost too carefully. No smudged ink, no torn edges. The handwriting was legible, even clean, not rushed, not distressed. And most peculiar of all, there were no prints. None from Antonio. None from anyone else. It was as if it had been placed there with gloves, with intent, by someone who didn't want to be found. Investigators began wondering. What if Antonio wasn't taken? What if he left? It was a question no one wanted to ask out loud. But as the clues stacked up, the silence in that car, the absence of witnesses, and the mechanical precision of a ransom note without soul, it all began to whisper one thing louder than the rest. Something here had been carefully arranged. And Antonio Ellis, whether victim or architect, had played his part. The case took a sudden turn when a sharp-eyed analyst caught something unexpected during a routine review. It was surveillance footage, grainy but unmistakable. A man in a Navy baseball cap, head tilted slightly downward, sunglasses shielding his eyes despite the overcast sky, stepping into a dingy corner store in East L.A. He moved like someone who didn't want to be recognized, but didn't want to look like he was trying not to be. A transaction took place. He paid in cash. No receipt. No loyalty card. The item? A prepaid burner phone. No contact name. No activation tied to his email. Clean. It was Antonio Ellis. The timestamp showed the purchase happened 3 days before he disappeared. That changed everything. Detectives had been combing through financials, work logs, and call records, looking outward for suspects. But now the gaze shifted, inward. Antonio was no longer just a missing person. He was a man who, by all accounts, had planned for something. What exactly was still unclear. But that burner phone, deliberately bought, untraceable, hidden, was no accident. It was a tool. And someone doesn't buy a tool unless they intend to use it. Then came the emails. His inbox was clean. Too clean. But the drafts folder, that told a different story. Several half-finished messages. All unsent. No recipients. Just phrases that read like breadcrumbs. If you're reading this, something didn't go the way I planned. I had no choice. Please tell Rachel I'm sorry. None of them gave away a location. None mentioned a name. But every line dripped with intent. Carefully measured language, vague enough to conceal, clear enough to hint. One draft simply read, "They won't understand, but maybe that's the point." It wasn't a goodbye letter. It wasn't even a confession. It was a narrative, constructed by someone who didn't know what would happen next, but wanted to leave just enough behind to stir the right questions. Detectives began connecting dots that hadn't seemed meaningful before. The perfect ransom note, untouched by fingerprints. The parked car, left in a location without witnesses. The neat placement of his wallet. His watch still on the dashboard. Every detail began to feel arranged. And then came the silence. No bank withdrawals. No phone calls from the burner. No sightings. It was as if Antonio had vanished off the map, exactly the way he wanted to. By the end of that week, the mood inside the department changed. White bars were erased. Timelines were redrawn. And the word victim was cautiously replaced with another, orchestrator. No one said out loud at first, but they were all thinking it. Antonio Ellis staged his own disappearance. He walked away from the life that had been crushing him from all sides, and did it in a way that made it look like someone else had slammed the door shut. Only one question remained. Why? And more urgently, how far had he planned to go? Just when the case seemed to be moving toward closure, it veered violently off course. It was a Tuesday morning when Rachel Ellis, Antonio's wife, stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, holding her phone in both hands. She had just opened a message, one that hadn't come through his number or the official line from investigators. It was short, blunt, the kind of message that doesn't ask. It commands. Deliver the money to Echo Park. 10 p.m. alone. No cops. There was no signature. No explanation. The tone felt entirely different from the earlier staged ransom note. This one carried weight. Urgency. And for the first time, the fear she had pushed down came rushing back up. This time, with new meaning, someone else was involved now. The investigators were notified immediately. The message had been sent from another burner phone, not the one Antonio had bought. This one had been purchased 2 days after his disappearance, in a corner store in South Central. Surveillance footage showed the buyer, a man with his hood pulled low, gloves on despite the heat, his head turned just enough for the camera to capture the line of his jaw, and a faded scar across his cheek. They ran the footage through facial recognition. His name was Manuel Carson, and he wasn't new to law enforcement. His file painted a portrait of a man who operated in the shadows: wire fraud, identity theft, extortion. His crimes were always indirect. He didn't break down doors. He manipulated people into handing him the keys. But this time, he had stepped into something different. And it wasn't just extortion. 3 nights earlier, at an abandoned warehouse 2 blocks off Imperial Highway, security cameras had captured a black SUV pulling into the lot just after midnight. The vehicle sat for 17 minutes before 2 figures exited, one leading the other by the elbow. The second figure moved sluggishly, as if disoriented or threatened. Detectives later enhanced the footage and confirmed what Rachel already feared. The man being led into the back of that SUV was Antonio Ellis. The full weight of what had happened began to sink in. Antonio had disappeared voluntarily. That much was clear. He had tried to escape his life. His debt, the pressure, the feeling of failure mounting at every turn. But while he staged his own kidnapping, someone else had been watching, listening, waiting for an opening. Carson had found that opening. Maybe Antonio had spoken too loudly in the wrong bar. Maybe he had confided in someone who had other ears in the room. Or maybe, like so many before him, he believed he was smarter than everyone else. But whatever the case, Manuel Carson had intercepted his plan. He didn't just piggyback on it. He hijacked it. And now, Antonio wasn't faking it anymore. He was really missing. Only this time, there were no carefully drafted emails. No calculated messages left behind. There was only silence. And a man with a criminal history who didn't need a reason to escalate. The FBI was alerted. Surveillance increased around Echo Park. But there were no more texts. No calls. Carson vanished just as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind only a chilling possibility. Antonio had played a game he wasn't built for. And now, the pieces were moving on a board he no longer controlled. The stage performance had become a real-life abduction, and the man who wrote the script was no longer the one calling the shots. There's a unique kind of silence that fills a room when betrayal steps out from behind the curtain. Not loud, not dramatic, just cold. It crept in the moment investigators opened the folder, the one that had taken days to decrypt, its contents hidden inside layers of digital camouflage. But when they broke through, what they found didn't point to another suspect. It pointed home. The messages were threaded in fragments, carefully worded, stripped of names, coded just enough to blend in. But they carried a rhythm, a familiarity. The exchange began weeks before Antonio's vanishing act. Short messages at first, then longer ones. Agreements, conditions, updates. And they didn't come from Carson's phone alone. The second number belonged to Rachel Ellis, the wife, the grieving wife, the one who had stood before the cameras, tear-streaked and trembling, asking for her husband's safe return. The one who had stood at police briefings and clutched the hands of detectives like a woman crushed under the weight of worry. She hadn't been waiting for answers. She had helped build the puzzle. When they confronted her, it wasn't loud. No shouting. No slammed fists. Just a printed page slid across the table. Lines of text stretching back over a month. One of the agents asked her to read them aloud. She didn't. She only stared at the words like they had been written by someone else. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but something gave. Her hands, maybe, they started trembling. That's when she spoke. She admitted that the messages were hers. All of them. She admitted that she had met Carson through a mutual acquaintance, someone Antonio owed money to. At first, it had been small talk, frustrations shared over coffee, complaints about debt, about the marriage, about feeling trapped. She didn't plan for it to go this far, she said. But it did. She hadn't known Antonio was planning to disappear. Not at first, but when she found out, she didn't try to stop him. Instead, she let it happen. She waited, and once he was gone, she passed the details to Carson, where the money would be, when Antonio would move, how long he could be off the grid before the story took over. In her words, it was meant to be clean, quiet. She wouldn't touch the money. She only wanted out, an end to the mess, to the man who, in her mind, had become more burden than husband. The detectives asked her if she had ever loved him. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the window. A long stare, then a whisper, barely audible, "I did, a long time ago." What made it worse, what burned the deepest for those who had rallied around her, was that she had played both roles perfectly. The worried wife, the betrayed partner. She had rehearsed every line, every expression, every trembling word. And all the while, she had been sending messages under the table, helping a criminal step in where her husband had tried to slip away. Some betrayals are born out of heat, others out of calculation. Rachel's was the latter. It was slow, thought out, a betrayal by inches. And now, the question wasn't just where Antonio was. It was how long Rachel had been preparing to let him go, and whether she ever intended for him to come back. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came in, early enough that most people were still pouring their first cup of coffee. A crew of construction workers had been clearing out a derelict property on the city's industrial edge. They'd come across a rusted storage container. One of them joked that it looked like something out of a crime show. No one laughed once they pried it open. The smell hit them first. Inside, beneath a pile of tarp and discarded insulation, they found him, Antonio Ellis. He was curled slightly, one arm pinned beneath his torso, the other stretched across his chest like he tried to shield himself in those final seconds. The autopsy report confirmed what detectives had already begun to suspect. He hadn't died in that container. He'd been killed first. Asphyxiation. Manual strangulation. There were bruises on his neck, deep and deliberate. No defensive wounds. No signs of a struggle. It meant he had trusted whoever got close enough. By the time the body was officially identified, word had already reached Carson. He'd been trying to disappear. New clothes, new ID, a last-minute bus ticket heading southwest. He'd made it almost to the Arizona border, keeping low, hopping rides, avoiding cameras. But it was a routine highway check, an old warrant that hadn't been cleared in the system. That finally put him back on the radar. They found cash rolled up in a sock. A second phone tucked under the seat. On it were the same texts investigators had traced weeks earlier. Timelines, updates, coded references to the drop and the exit. He didn't speak during the ride back. Didn't ask what he was being charged with. Just stared out the window and kept tapping his fingers against his thigh, like counting seconds or losses. Meanwhile, in a quiet suburb where Rachel had tried to return to a normal rhythm, where she had resumed her neighborhood jogs and pretended the world still owed her sympathy, a second team made their move. She was folding laundry when they came in. Calm, controlled. Her face didn't change much. Not when they read the warrant. Not even when they asked if she understood the charges. She nodded, then turned her eyes to the hallway, where a photo of her and Antonio from their wedding day still hung. It had been crooked for weeks. She'd never bothered to straighten it. Her charges were precise. Conspiracy to commit kidnapping, wire fraud, obstruction of justice. The list wasn't short, and the penalties weren't light. She didn't resist. Just walked out in her socks, blinking against the daylight like someone waking up from a very long nap. The news broke within the hour. 2 arrests, 1 body, and a marriage that had unraveled into something none of their neighbors, none of their friends, had ever guessed at. Reporters swarmed the street. Cameras angled for glimpses through windows. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Why? But the truth was layered. Antonio had faked a crime. Carson had hijacked it. And Rachel had made a choice. One that ended with handcuffs, headlines, and a storage container that would be sealed forever. The sky was a heavy gray on the day they buried Antonio Ellis. There was no announcement in the papers. No obituary filled with carefully selected photographs or stories from those who loved him. Just a name on a temporary marker. A short service. A patch of earth near the far edge of the cemetery where hardly anyone goes. Only 5 people came. One of them stood apart, not saying much. The others kept their heads down, murmuring among themselves, unsure what to say or how to say it. There was no eulogy, no closing hymn, no carefully worded sermon about redemption or legacy. Just a low hum of the wind, the sound of shoes shifting on gravel, and the soft thud of dirt against the casket. By then, the case had already made headlines. Reporters had long since moved on to the next tragedy. The courtroom dates were scheduled. The statements had been taken. And yet, despite everything that had come to light, there was still a silence around Antonio that no one could explain. He had written no letter, left no message. There were no journal entries or voice recordings. Nothing to clarify what he had truly wanted. Whether he had meant to disappear forever, or just long enough to make a point. Whether the plan had gotten away from him, or if, in some part of him, he'd always expected it to end the way it did. The idea to vanish hadn't come all at once. It built slowly, months of resentment, of closed doors and long nights, arguments whispered behind curtains, text messages read and deleted. He began with small steps, transferring funds, changing logins, researching places that didn't ask too many questions. He never told anyone. Not his family, not his friends, not even Rachel, at least not at first. He believed, or perhaps convinced himself, that it was survival. But there were too many pieces, too many loose ends. And one of those pieces, Carson, saw opportunity. When Rachel finally learned what Antonio had done, it wasn't fury that moved her. It was weariness. A kind of tiredness that had settled in so deeply, she no longer questioned right from wrong, only whether anything could be undone. She made her own decisions, sent her own messages, and by the time she realized just how far it had all gone, it was already beyond correction. Antonio's last days were silent. The messages stopped. The phone went dark. He had chosen the place where he thought he could hide. What he hadn't chosen, what he hadn't predicted, was that someone else had followed him, and that person came with hands that didn't hesitate. Now, the container was gone, seized, the property cleared out, and Antonio lay beneath a lawn with no flowers, no inscription, just a name, and 2 dates that told nothing of what happened in between. There were no winners, not in this story. Carson would spend the rest of his life trying to appeal charges he never denied. Rachel was left in a holding cell, her lawyer offering the same advice week after week. Say less. The people who once knew Antonio now only remembered him in pieces. His laugh at a cookout, his voice in a voicemail no one could bring themselves to delete. And somewhere between the lines of planning and panic, love and revenge, an entire life was lost. The camera pulled back slowly, as if even it wasn't sure how to say goodbye. The grave became smaller, swallowed by the land around it. No answers came. No music played. Just the stillness that follows when all the wrong things are finally over, and all the right things are too far gone to fix. If you found this case as gripping as we did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Vic's Crime Cases Exposed. We break down the real stories behind the headlines, twists, motives, and everything in between. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and stay one step ahead in every investigation.